So, mellow greetings, one and all. I'm Christopher Driver, and with me, as always, is Mr. J.r.r. You are tuned into Frivolous Gravitas, a podcast of substantive conversations. You're here for some more intellectual gray matter comestibles. You're in the right place. For those tuning in on iTunes, welcome, bienvenue. You're speaking with Canadians.
Yeah.
All monikers aside, though, let's just get straight into chewing the fat. It's a hard skip. So remember, you may always engage by leaving your thoughts and interests and engagements in the comments there. We always love to hear what you have to say. And don't be shy. All comments are welcome. So today we're going to cover some cultural lore and our species' propensity for creating gods through storytelling. And we'll let Jordan kick us off and just talk about some old mythologies, and we'll work a little bit through chronological order, I guess, starting with the oldest and bringing in the new.
Yeah, I do want to talk about the gods, but I think one of the things is that I've noticed recently, and this is kind of like a thought, it's going to be probably more of a thought experiment for me because I've been thinking about this for a couple of weeks. And that is to say that, the gods are dead, long live the gods. And we have a new set of gods. And I've noticed that we have this propensity in the way we act to engage in almost a passive myth making. And this can be seen way, way back in time, back to what we would describe as kind of our ancient sacred texts. These texts that, even though no one believes in that specific way that society is built around. So, you get books like the Vedas, which actually the Hindu religion is actually still going quite strong, but others really aren't. There's very few worshippers of the ancient Mesopotamian religions, or the ancient Mesoamerican religions, or the ancient Greek religion, which kind of Christianity put, and then Islam put quite the nail in the coffin there, because they were more representative stories, I would say. But that's not today's conversation. But what was happening was you get these religions weren't started around, there's a god, I saw him, let's go worship him. No, that would be pretty cool. Or something like, Stargate aliens come down and say, yo, I'm your god. And they're all like, well, obviously he landed in a spaceship. But what happened was these stories got amalgamated, as far as we can tell, all over the world. This happened. This wasn't just subject to one area. Okay, the best way to think of it is you have a bunch of cavemen and women sitting around a campfire, and what are they going to do? Well, it's the end of the day. They're tired from doing all that hunting and gathering and fishing and weaving and stuff, whatever cavemen do. Accounting, I guess, but they
kicking rocks.
You owe me 6% interest on that fish stock. No, they would sit around and tell stories, and we know this because there is in every single culture. Fight me on this. Every single culture had an oral tradition at some point. Even in fact, we still have an oral tradition in our culture. It's just overshadowed by a lot of our other institutions of storytelling that we have now. That's also another story. I'm going to write that one down. I want to talk about that. So I really want to talk about that one day. But what is interesting is that these got codified slowly over time into kind of canon, which for those watching, canon is not a canon. Canon is like the accepted stories. So you get something like Star Wars, where everyone's worrying about what's canon. Oh no, he actually didn't do that. No, these books aren't canon anymore. This isn't what happened in the story. This is a true version of the story. And this comes from Catholics who, had all these other books in the Bible that they're like, no. That's not part of the Jesus story. This is part of the Jesus story. This is the canon.
That's probably the most relatable reference too, because the canonization of the different Bibles is basically how they chose the different creeds or sects of Christianity.
Yeah.
It's based on which books they allow in and which interpretations they allow in as standard.
Sometimes it was something way stupider.
Yeah, but canonization of the Bible is probably the most relatable reference, I think, to canon.
Yeah. And we argue about this constantly nowadays with our new mythologies, which, spoilers, I guess. But what would happen is, again, these stories kept getting told over millennia, like literal millennia. Like they start from the beginnings of language, you probably maybe even before, where you can tell a story without words. It's just not going to be as sophisticated. And so as time goes on, as humans engage with their environment and become more like the humans we see today, there are stories evolved with us. And around about the early Greek period, a new technology starts coming into play, which is writing. And we start writing down these stories, and drawing also becomes more sophisticated this time too. And what happens is some intrepid individuals start taking down hearsay stories and this mythology that's created slowly. And that's kind of the thing. And they write it down. And we get things like Homer, we get stuff like the Vedas, we get stuff like Lao Tzu, Confucius. This is all in the same general time period, actually, as well, which is very strange. Well, not strange, it's really interesting. And that's another story too. But these books start getting written down, and all of a sudden we have these stories, and they're written down and they're codified, they're canonized, and they're set down, and they can no longer change. But what's interesting about the oral histories, or the oral stories, is that they didn't really change all that much over the course of thousands of years. Well, they improved, and they got more sophisticated, and more details got added, and a couple characters got added, and the gods changed form. Literally, like the gods in the early Greek period are a lot different than the gods in the late Greek period. In fact, you have like the Titans were kind of like proto gods, as not important. And so, but the important thing, I think, for what I'm talking about here is that the gods were a negotiated process that came about through interaction with the real world. And so you get ideas like Neptune and Zeus and Poseidon, and characters like Achilles and Hector and Andromache, who we got wrong in that other podcast, and I remembered it, and thank you for correcting us, Chris.
No, we both got it wrong.
Yeah. I should have known that.
Close, though.
That was close. But start with, we got an A one. But these characters and gods, and the characters aren't too far off from gods. If you see what Achilles can do, you get like the buffest, Navy SEAL, and he'll be like, that guy's a beast. And he was a bit of a beast. And these superhuman characters represent what humanity can do, and the gods represent nature itself. Oversimplification, I know, but
I think we also reference the superhuman characteristics and actions and behaviors of human characters through our mythologies too. So it's almost like a story of transcendence, where you get mythologies that are wrapped inside of the gods. You have like Cleobis and Bido, how it explains sort of, or it describes sort of a higher virtue for humans to live by, based on a story that's related to or relative to the gods. Or like you get half gods like Hercules, who also have their own.
That was Hercules is always interesting because he's a god, he's a half god, and Zeus is like, "You're special," and he's like, "I'm special," and he proceeds to screw up.
Yeah, like a human.
Yeah, and most of, I think, I might put some books in the comments. I went on a mythology kick a couple of years ago, like a heavy kick. Man, I should just start doing drugs. These people were created by sitting around going, what do you want to talk about? I want to talk about, the sea, and I want to talk about a story of someone engaging with the sea. And if you're telling someone, okay, so there's a storm that's coming in, a kid asks you, and you're in the Neolithic period. So, you're proto-civilization, and your kid asks you, why is there wind? And you have to go, why does the sea calm some days? And why is it, really seeming to be angry other days? And there's a force, but the force is personified by a god. So this is, the sea itself is is the god personified. No, what's the opposite of personified? Manifest.
Objectified?
No, not really. I wouldn't say that. Maybe manifest? No, that's not even right either. Anyway, maybe
I think what you're trying to say is like they're anthropomorphizing forces, basically.
Right.
Like, so nature's forces are becoming characters.
Right. So what they're doing, and the word character is a great way of putting it, because they are trying to explain, and there was a woman who wrote a book literally called Mythology, I think. And she essentially, her claim was that the Greek myths were a way for the Greeks to explain were to explain the world around them. And you can't explain the world through science, but it creates you need to do it in a certain way. You're seeing just truth when you're looking at science. Like, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing hydrogen here. Well, that doesn't tell you anything that you can really use other than, okay, what can I use hydrogen for? It's very clinical. It's very this and that. It doesn't tell you why you have hydrogen.
Most myths are conjured up before the scientific method became standard practice, though, I think.
Yeah. I think Greenblatt would, was it Greenblatt? He would say that the scientific method has always existed, which it has. People being like, how do I get rock into sharp rock?
Calculus has always existed, but until we discover it, we don't use it, then...
No, I mean, not more in like it's always kind of there. It's kind of always been accidentally used in history. There's always been a guy who's just been sitting around and he's been accidentally using for as far back, I'm going to try a bunch of stuff and see what works. And we've accidentally used the scientific method forever. And that's a lot of our stuff like, what's his name? Ancient Greek and Syracuse, Archimedes. He would do a bunch of scientific method stuff. I'm going to test stuff. And Aristotle was accidentally using it here and there. But
Aristotle kind of invented the process.
You could make that argument.
The way he gathered animals from all over the world and then started cataloging them, and that is very scientific. Whereas before, people just thought about stuff in a scientific way, but without actually making a rigorous study of it. Do you know what I mean?
Whenever I think about Aristotle, I don't think about him sitting around teaching Alexander. I think about him wandering around looking at plants. Literally.
Yeah, that's what he spent most of his life doing, so...
My internet is terrible. I can't look at... It's not looking at anything.
But I mean, he got that from Plato, of course, but Plato wrote about Socrates and stuff, like ideas of thought, and he had these Platonic solids and atomic theory and things like that. But he didn't really do a rigorous process of it. He did a rigorous process of the thought, but he didn't do a rigorous process of the writing.
Yeah. Plato is a lot more interested in what we would now call anthropology. Or psychology. And
he was more like psychology being a science, where today we're still kind of like, it's kind of a science, but
when you do it right, it's a science. But
it doesn't have definitive values or results. Do you know what I mean? That's the difference between sciences, It's not that it's not science, it's just that it's distinctly different from something that's quantifiable.
Yeah. Where was I? Right. So that was it. Sorry, my brain just had to come back. Science tells you a lot about the what and a lot about the how. It can even tell you a bit about the why, but it doesn't really tell you what you're supposed to do with it. So, it's kind of like ought and is type of thing. But that argument aside, you really need to nest that information within a story in order to know how to use it properly. Okay, I've got a motor, and I know how the motor works, like a little magneto machine. You hook a power cell up to it. What can I do with it? Well, what happens is a lot of times someone tells us a story about how they used it, and then we're like, oh, I should try that. And all of a sudden you have this thing, this mythology of this one guy who hooked the motor up to his, blinds, and now he just presses a button and those blinds go up automatically. And you're like, oh, I can do that. And so we tell each other stories. And this is what we did because it's easier to tell each other stories, especially in verse for some reason. That's a neat thing. I'd like to get an expert on that. And this goes back to our rap hip hop episode where for some reason we can remember things better when it rhymes and has a beat. That's just something. Tempo. Yeah. So that's just something that is. And so they weren't just sitting around telling each other prose like once upon a time there was a guy called Darth Vader. No, it was actually, I don't even know where my Iliad is.
It's all right. We know what stories are.
Yeah. So like I sing you a song of gods and men or something, or the deeds of so I can't look it up.
But I think it's because it rouses more of our senses that way. Like, because we have so much of our brains dedicated to our visual perception that when you speak or have stories that bring up imagery, it's much easier for us to remember that way. And then audio sort of reinforces the mental imagery. Yeah. Because we can remember audio separately from words and separately from concepts and separately from like tempo. So it's kind of like you're stimulating more parts of the brain when you're telling a story in verse than if you're just speaking it outright. That's my best guess.
It's kind of like sing "O Canada" and then write it down. You'll sing "O Canada" flawlessly, or if for our American ones, sing the Star Spangled Banner. Like I could probably sing the Star Spangled Banner, but if you tell me to write down the words to Star Spangled Banner, I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm going to actually literally have to sing it to myself and then write it down as I'm going. And this is just something weird that happens. And so you get these, I don't know, bards or something, but it was pretty much just people just sitting around talking to each other and telling stories to each other. And the stories would meld together, kind of like you see in the Marvel movies now, but we'll get to that in a bit. But what happens is, all of a sudden you get a story. One guy tells a story about, this guy, half god, he's super strong. He goes and does a thing, and everyone's like, "Oh, that's great." And then another guy will tell a story about the god Zeus and what kind of guy he is. And also over time, the gods get fleshed out as people. Over time, this happens. And eventually people like Horace and Ovid and people like that would write it down as kind of definitive versions, but that's not really how they were written. And those poets put their own kind of flourish onto it. This is kind of what they wanted to see. And they did an amazing job, but they weren't telling their own stories. They were writing down stories, kind of like the Brothers Grimm caught up, going around Germany, collecting fairy stories. And
books of the Bible were a lot like that too. I mean, I know religious fanatics will say that God explicitly wrote them through somebody or whatever, but like technically speaking, if you look back paleontologically, you could find people had written these stories down in different ways, like the Epic of Gilgamesh being converted into like the Noah's Ark story. Things like that are very, very common too.
Yeah.
Where they repurpose stories and characters into a new verse that suits a new culture and a new tradition, basically.
Yeah, and this is really, I don't know if this is obvious actually, in something like the Aeneid, which is the Roman Iliad, pretty much, written by Livy.
The Aeneid is an awesome story, though, by the way.
Written by
For any of our
Virgil.
listeners, they should definitely check that out.
Oh man, I just committed a sin there. So it's written by Virgil, not Livy.
I don't think we heard you.
Oh geez, sorry. Well, good. So essentially he was saying, okay, this minor character in the Iliad, which is one of the best examples of what we're talking about, is, traveled the world after kind of Odyssey style, like Ulysses, and he ended up founding the city of Rome and instituting it as, a holy city. And we have this new, you could call it propaganda, but it's still, good story. It's a myth of Rome, kind of, that just like you said, it's one that's almost updated for the new context. This is what Rome is. And he wrote a story to say the Greeks had their thing going on. This is particularly Roman. So they wrote their own story, and they wrote their own kind of origin story. And
You're talking about Romulus and Remus?
No. So this happened after Romulus and Remus. I think Romulus and Remus came around and were like, we're going to start, they like set the foundation, but then it quickly got, after a couple generations, it became subject to tyrants. If I've got my mythological time scale off, just
that's always my problem with myths, is figuring out the chronology.
Yeah. And then after a couple bad kings, and then one's called Tyrannus. My internet.
Tyrannus the tyrant.
Yeah, it's my internet. So what happens is they make a new story for themselves, and it's based on all these stories that people were telling around campfires and explaining the world with. And then all of a sudden they come around and say, I'm going to explain the world that we have now based on what we see. And it was kind of an Augustinian propaganda. And because it was written during the reign of Emperor Augustine, not Saint Augustine, different guy. And Augustine, sorry. So you have this process, this slow process of evolution of these stories, and eventually they get codified. But what happens is then they stop being able to explain the world. They kind of get discarded. And this is what happened when Christianity came around, and everyone's like, well, this is a better story. Then cynicism, atheist cynics, whatever. I don't really care what you think at this point, because what happened was the Western world kind of said, these stories are great, but I like this. And so but the stories never really left. The Christians still read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they loved Aristotle because it propped up St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, who used it thoroughly and called him the philosopher. And they used a lot of that. But what's interesting is that the stories never really left, and we have them in print now, and everyone says, oh, you got to read the story. But we don't have this expectation that this is what happened. This is the story of the gods that happened. It doesn't really matter that that's not, excuse me, how the reality works anymore, because there's an aspect to it, and this is kind of what I want to get to, in the stories that transcends some scientific reality. It engages in a kind of a mythological truth that points to, I would say, the Logos. Oh yeah, there's Jordan talking about the Logos again. But yeah, okay. So the Logos is that thing that I talk about, where that is the relationship between reality and your perception. Ooh, that doesn't really explain it at all. When you can't really see the logos. It's just, logos is just kind of the way things exist. And that objective reality, you can also call it, the word of God, the logic to the system of the universe might be a good way of putting it. Logos being kind of a proto word for logic. And there's something about the story of some of these old stories that really hit home, and it doesn't matter what cultural context you're in. You can read the Greek myths and be in Japan and still understand, like, I get this. And you can be in, like, I've read.
Likewise, the Japanese can read the Greek, or the Greeks can read the Japanese myths and get the same type of response from it. Like, it's sort of universal to our culture entirely.
Yeah, like I've read the Three Kingdoms, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which was really interesting. It reminded me a lot of the ancient Greek stories, but in a Chinese context. And there's a reason why the Chinese just keep making game after game after movie after game, and like TV shows on this one instance in their history, kind of like we keep making movies about. I don't know.
The Wild West.
Well, yeah, we'll get to that. Because one of the things that's happening, especially, let's just get into it. Westerns are important to our society. There, I said it. And why is that? Because there's something about something like the Aeneid, like a Western, like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, like the Vedas, that explain what is going on and how to act in the system that they are in. And what's interesting is that when you study them, you become more attuned to what's going on around you. And not it's like, I understand. I kind of understand. And it's this heuristic where an intelligent person can understand what's going on. But sometimes people need a bit of help, because not everyone can be, some people aren't, not everyone's a genius. I think
there's a danger in that, though, and like choosing one interpretation over the other because of somebody's intellectual prowess or whatever. Like, no, I think it's more of a feeling. Storytelling and cultures are more felt than understood.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We can't all be Virgil. We can't all be,
Well, we could, but it would just be like child's play at that point. It wouldn't actually be anything special. Virgil would just be like, oh, you write like a teenager. If all your teenagers could write like that.
There are differences in capability between people. I'm not really gonna. But
the interpretability, I think, what makes a myth really stand out and stand the test of time, I think, is the generalization of it. The
universality of it.
Everybody can sort of get the same type of message from it, even if it's not explicitly directly the same interpretation. People feel the same thing from the same stories.
Yes, and that's what's important about them, is that infused in these by the great minds that came up with them, and the thing is that a lot of these myths, they're important not because great minds came up with them. A lot of these stories have been being told for like maybe even tens of thousands of years, like an absurdly long amount of time, and they've been refined for that amount of years. Like the stories of one of them is Baucis and Philemon, which is a story that just gets me right here every single time. Why? I have no cultural context to it. I am not Greek. I don't believe in the gods, blah, 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 but it still hits me like a hammer, because it's about a couple that gets visited, this old couple that gets visited by Hermes and oh man, I almost said Jupiter, Zeus. And they have Hermes and Zeus.
The juice.
This is the juice. I've got the juice.
Basically kind of like OJ.
It's just like plug it in and need some juice, like in electricity.
I meant Simpson, O.J. Simpson.
Oh yeah, I know. But they essentially just give these two old people a hard time, and they're like, they're not rich and they've got a goose, and they say, oh, feed us that goose. And they're like, oh yes, because law of hospitality, you give what you have to people on the road. And they end up being perfect guests, hosts, even though they screw up a bit. They're trying as hard as they can, and they screw up, and they say, please ask for our forgiveness, blah 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 blah, because Zeus and Hermes are playing games with them and saying, hey, let's screw it up. We're going to make them try to be good hosts and get in the way of them doing that with our magic powers. And so they screw up, and they say, you guys have been exemplary beyond anything we could have asked for. You maintained, everything in the face of, you were good hosts in spite of everything that happened. You obviously are good people. We'll give you anything you want. And the thing they ask for is they want to die at the same time because they're so in love with each other. And so what happens is he says like, perfect. And they don't want to live one moment without each other, which is just hits you right here. And they become priests of this temple to Zeus for the rest of their lives. And when they die, what happens is, they sink into the earth, and then this tree grows up, and it's the type of tree that kind of winds around itself, and that explains why that tree exists in the world. So this is how they told their stories. What's with that tree? Oh, well, that's a great story. And they would tell themselves that story, and they wouldn't tell them about the tree. They'd say, okay, that's why that tree exists. Okay, good. The story of Philemon and Baucis. No. The thing that's important to that story is what it tells you about things like marriage, things like hospitality, things like do unto others. This is
geography. Like, it helps you plan and understand the map of your surrounding areas and the different cultures around you too. Like, they have myths about rivers and why there's different color people on the other side of a river, kind of thing.
Yeah, Herodotus is really funny. He didn't tell myths. He was trying to write history, but he's like, black people are the best. They have some really cool stuff going on. They're super strong. They're the smartest.
They got spices.
And he thought that their semen was actually black. Because
it shows he never seen one, but
well, he'd probably seen one, but
I meant the semen.
Yeah, no, he probably didn't see one. He also thought that the Arabians had goats with like 7-foot long tails that they put on carts, that the Arabians would put on carts for them, and they just walk around with these carts behind them, and it's just like, that probably didn't happen, but it's a good story. But that's more of Herodotus was telling a history, but he was trying. He was
the first historian, to be fair.
He was surprisingly accurate about some weird stuff.
I think his method, though, like his approach to the detail, is what made him so famous. And not specifically the details themselves, but the fact that he was trying to chronicle things in writing was the first time people had ever done that, really.
Yes, but actually another thing about him was that he did infuse a lot of myth into it, because he was talking about Xerxes and Darius.
Yeah, but I think he believed it, like, sincerely.
Well, they had no reason to believe otherwise, and like, really, it didn't matter what the truth was at that point, because he's telling a history of the Persians from a Greek perspective. But he gets into stuff like, and then the Pharaoh of Egypt, who was a subject of the Persians at the time, went to the Sphinx, and the Sphinx asked him a question, and the riddle of the Sphinx happened. And then I'm pretty sure that's not what happened, but it's infusing that into their reality. This is how they saw things. I don't want to make a postmodernist thing, because it's not actually how things were, but the story of their world existed like that. And not everyone believed that. It's like, just because Herodotus wrote it doesn't, because he did have his critics, because you have people like Thucydides, who wrote the Peloponnesian Wars. And this is a history. It's boring because it's a war between. It documents the Peloponnesian Wars, and it's very matter of fact. There's very little mythology in it. But
That's the Sparta Greek War, right?
oh man, I studied it very recently. It is, yes. Yeah, Sparta and Athens, and you have a bunch of leagues get together and fight each other because the
That wasn't
Persians were
like the Nebuchadnezzar one with the Persians across the mountain ranges and stuff.
That was in Herodotus. I think he did cover that, but the
okay, that's why I'm
Peloponnesian,
confusing them then. He did
yeah,
do
the
both.
Greek histories are not really taught, but what happens is, short story, the Persians decided that the Greeks were much too strong to fight head on. So what they're going to do is, and this is, our problems are not new. They sent in people to influence the people there and turn them against each other and divide and conquer. So they sent in propagandists, essentially. A ton of them flooded.
See our media episode.
Yeah. Our problems are not new. And so all of them. And so they started a bunch of wars, but the Persian Empire declined anyways. And that's not really mythology. So let's skip ahead, because I think I've made my point, to what's happened. We've killed all these gods. We've even, I hate to say it, but the Christian God is almost half in the bag. Now, why is that? And I think
what are you basing that off of, though? I'm just curious.
There's a lot of atheists.
Yeah, but there's still a lot of Christians.
Oh no, I know. That's why I only say half. Half is it's still strong, but it's.
I don't think half of all Christians have left the faith, though.
No. Well, since the Middle Ages, yeah. Oh, I'm thinking like a long time scale here. So if we compare nowadays to even around the Reformation, they would call us a godless society and go to war with us. Catholics and the Protestants would,
like South America and Latin America is very, very religious, and all of Africa is very religious, and all of India is very religious. And
well, India's very they're very strong in their Hindu faith. It's a throwaway comment. Let's not dwell on it too much.
Oh, sorry. I thought it was relative. Sorry.
No. It's although I hear Christianity is taking hold in China you need to look that up. It's a rumor, but it's a really interesting one.
There's enough people in China, though.
Yeah, I know, but apparently it's like gangbusters over there. People are eating it up. But I don't know why. I would like to look into that.
Because Jesus is communist, that's why.
No, it's because Jesus is way cool. So
he's straight up commie.
That's another episode. But
so we've abandoned our gods.
Sorry, my brain went to that like, I know. So my brain went somewhere completely wrong. So we've abandoned a lot of these other gods, but the actions that made those gods originally haven't gone away. The aspect of our humanity that does that storytelling, we're storytellers, that hasn't changed at all. And what happens is we just do it better, and we do it faster, and we do it in more detail and more depth. And you get people writing myths based on the way they see their reality around them. So you get stuff in the early times, you get stuff like Cervantes, and you get stuff like Milton, who are like, Milton is very like, he's going to reinvent the relationship. Oh, I guess Dante too. They reinvent the relationship between man, God, and the devil with these elaborate plays. And you get stuff like Shakespeare. Shakespeare is an amazing example of this, because he wanted to tell stories that explained stuff for Shakespeare, kind of. But he was exploring different themes, the themes of which you can explore in, I guess, if you really want to get into that particular thing, read the book Will of the World by Stephen Greenblatt. Don't take my word for it, but it's a great book. But it gets into his themes, and it also gets into the world of Shakespeare, Stephen Shakespeare. But these characters came alive instantly with Shakespeare. You get people like Hamlet, who, like, even if you haven't read Hamlet, you kind of have a general idea of who Hamlet is. And
I don't.
okay, Hamlet was the kid, the son of the king, who, when the king married his mother, so the king's his uncle and married his mother, and he hates it, and everyone decides to just go and nuts, and everything ends in tragedy. And it's another famous one would be Macbeth. Macbeth is that tragedy with a king who was tempted by fate to, become king, and he took it. And his wife sitting in the background going like, yo, you should just kill people. It'd be great. Kill the king. He's in there right now. Here's a knife. And so he does it. And then he has to, you see the internal conflict of his ambition going through the whole play. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. But the glory of it is that he didn't ignore any classes. He was telling stories based on how he saw the world. And he was a brilliant man, because I recently read a definition of intelligence recently that I just thought was brilliant, where intelligence, and this is kind of a Greek definition, where intelligence is the ability to see the world as it is. And I just think that's fascinating, because now that doesn't mean that's not the same thing as capability, where I can just lift rocks really well. But you see what needs to be done. You see the world as it is. And Shakespeare definitely saw the world as it is, and it shows in his work, because it resonated instantly with England. And then it resonated instantly with, France and Germany. And the Russians absolutely loved Shakespeare. It's in, if you read like Tolstoy or what's his name? He wrote The Idiot. Dostoevsky, he references Shakespeare quite a bit. Heck, the movie Ran is King Lear set in samurai times, and it's one of the best adaptations of Shakespeare ever. We get it. There's an adaptation of Coriolanus, highly recommend it, with Gerard Butler and Ralph Fiennes, and it's set in, they spruce it up so that all the costume is like set in America. It looks like the Romans look like Americans, and the Volscians look like kind of second world, maybe Soviet influenced Italians, essentially. And all the combat is with guns, but they don't change a line of dialogue. And it's amazing.
Like the Romeo and Juliet adaptation with Leonardo DiCaprio that I love so much.
Yeah, I gotta watch that one.
What was his name? God, that Spanish guy.
Jorge.
Doesn't matter. Oh, John Leguizamo. That's the guy's name.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So these stories, for some reason, when you stick them in different contexts, they still work. And the people, when you watch them, it's interesting, because you'll bring someone, random person, to a Shakespeare play, and then they'll just get it. And it's weird, because it's just, all this flowery language, all this, overly clever verbiage, all this intricate plots. But then they're watching it, because he's such a master, people just get it. And my thesis, I guess, here, this is not the end of the introduction, but is that Hamlet and Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet, our part of our new pantheon, this almost democratized pantheon of characters that help us explain the world around us, and through myth. And we keep telling ourselves myth, and different in more interesting ways. And this goes into Westerns, which I think explain a lot. So you get people like, I can't even think of the Western, but you get a lot of tropes. You get the lone gunslinger, who's now a god. He's an American god, not like Neil Gaiman's, I think. Well, maybe, I guess. But he's a god of America. This guy who goes and makes it on his own. The prospector, the bandit, the madam, all these tropes that you don't even need to watch a movie of it and you understand them. You understand these people because they represent aspects of reality that we can see in reality. And then we want to play with those. We want to see what happens when we put different aspects of reality next to each other. We want to, and storytelling and myth making is kind of a way of doing that. We can place aspects of reality into this crucible of story and come up with these new forms of understanding that we hadn't thought before. Like, what happens when you put the gunslinger next to a next to the Pinkerton's chasing a gunslinger. Pinkerton's like a government bounty hunter. And what happens when you put those two characters together? Or a more famous one being kind of the story of like the kid and the cowboy. You get that with the Mandalorian right now. And we want to tell these stories over and over again because you can't just, some stories are simple and you can just be like, oh yeah, it's this is what it's trying to tell me, and those stories are boring and they suck. A story, it's the same reason why we got into the rap and hip hop thing, where you want to unveil it unwraps itself in your head.
See, the thing that's interesting to me though is the way that they correlate across time. So when you look at stories from like King Minos, where he's got a minotaur and a labyrinth where he traps kids because he's angry about his own child dying or whatever, and then you can kind of draw parallels from that over to like John Wayne looking after a kid when he's a murderer and killing. It's just interesting how we went from personifying gods and creating their inadequacies and insecurities and projecting ourselves into gods to have characters to discuss these types of abstract personality conflicts that we have in just everyday life, but describe them in a supernatural way that's more fanciful, but it's more interesting. So it's easier to remember and ruminate. And because of that, everybody can discuss those issues with other people with some kind of common baseline. So everybody has a common ground of relatability when they're discussing things that they otherwise couldn't articulate because they weren't as educated and they weren't as well read and yada, yada, yada. But when everybody knows the same story, the story can be done in a play. It can be done in verse over a campfire. It could be done just as like a parent trying to put their kid to sleep or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And then you've got symbols all over the place, like idols and little, what do you call that? Like when you set up a
shrine,
yeah. So these types of reinforcement efforts sort of remind people of the stories every day that they walk by, even in their own house, or like crucifixes around their necks and things like that.
The story is so important that they need a reminder of it.
Right. And because everybody's got the same types of reminders, I can walk in front of you wearing a crucifix, and you can then understand the interpretation of my regalia. You know what I mean?
And I'll probably understand that story and be like, oh, I probably shouldn't swear around this guy as much. Or if someone's wearing...
Relate to the person on a metaphysical questions. So you can actually discuss things that you otherwise couldn't without the terminology or the baseline stories that underpin those types of discussions. It's by having mythologies that everybody sort of understands and agrees upon collectively, whether that's a Marvel movie or whether that's an island with a half man, half horse type creature.
Yeah.
Chasing children around.
Well, it's interesting because my students, you bring this up because you make an interesting point, because my students, a lot of them don't know the story of Christ, which is, strange. I'm just like, oh, I don't know, who Jesus is. And they're like, no. And I'm like, oh, like it's underpinning so many of our myths. Like even our modern myths will reference the Bible every once in a while. So you kind of need to go back because, all of our, you see like Christian imagery just end up in everything because it's so powerful. And you have it showing up in Star Wars because the reference, like you said, imbues it. I don't know if you said this, but I'm going to riff on you. It imbues it with the scene with more meaning without actually saying he's being crucified. It's like dull, bad storytelling. See me after class. And, having kind of, there's that scene where Luke Skywalker's hanging outside the Cloud City and he's kind of just prostrate. He's like asking for help. And you kind of understand that he has just gone through hell. He's gone through the underworld, yes, I know I'm not referencing Jordan B. Peterson here, but I'm more referencing people like Orpheus or something, where they literally have to go through hell, or Hercules, who has to go through hell.
Wasn't that also part of the Aeneid, where like he couldn't look back, or his
no,
wife
that was
would...
Orpheus.
Orpheus?
That one hits me right here, because like
Yeah,
his love of his life, he goes and rescues her. He's like, yes, but you can't look back until she's out. And right at the last second, he looks back and loses her forever.
And to me, that's also similar to like Medusa, where you can't look her in the eyes, but you have to slay her. And then that story is kind of similar to the Hydra, slaying the Hydra, where the heads keep regenerating every time you cut one off.
How many movies do that thing where it's like a Hydra, and everyone's like, yeah,
yeah,
and that's all you need to say. And they understand the nature of the enemy.
In more modern movies too, you've always got a hero that is self-sacrificing, like Jesus. In on that same tangent there, just sort of what I was trying to get to.
No, you made a good point, and I kind of off your point. I want to make an elaboration. I want to make an example of this point because I think it's worth it. I'm going to take two characters, Dido, which is the queen of Carthage, in the Aeneid, and she, spoilers, it's been about 2,000 years. If you haven't read
seen it yet, it's your fault.
You've had enough time. She tempts quite well, does a good job of it, tempts Aeneas with, stay with me. We can rule this kingdom. You can be king of Carthage, and we can rule over this great kingdom that I have here. And Carthage is depicted as this great city. Famously, it's Rome's greatest enemy, and it will become Rome's greatest enemy. And so they're fated to be, adversaries in the international stage. And so he says, no, I must go and follow my destiny, because one of the gods, I think it was Venus, comes around, and she's like, yo, you can't stay with her, you need to follow your destiny, or bad things will happen, blah blah blah. Or I don't remember the exact passage, but essentially the gods say, can't do that, you got to go do what you need to do. You have two paths here to choose, and he chooses to follow his destiny instead of actually a very good option of just living with this woman that absolutely adores him, and having this kingdom that he can rule over benevolently, blah 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 blah. But he leaves, and what happens is, as he's leaving, he looks over, and Dido lights this giant pyre up and sacrifices herself in her grief. And this is seen as like, yeah, she lost what she had, so there's no point in living. She sees that it's necessary, and people in the past would have understand that, and people nowadays would not really understand that. I'm going to go not just kill myself, because she could have easily done something easier, like Cleopatra, using another myth to explain a myth. Here we go. And she used a snake to poison herself in the bathtub, but she decided to light herself on fire, and I think she threw herself off the castle, or whatever, they had a castle then. And this was seen as kind of noble grief, I would say,
which is also similar to the samurai traditions. So
yes,
there are cross references between cultures even.
Yeah, well, samurai traditions have so much in common, thanks to a lot of Hollywood, but with Westerns, and I kind of want to get into that a little later. But I want to juxtapose this with a modern myth, with a character in Lord of the Rings, which is also something I want to talk a lot about. And nerd, the character of Eowyn, which is she's the royalty of this kingdom of Rohan. She is this really attractive young woman who, is got it really hot for the main character, not the main character, but one of the main characters, Aragorn, because he's this king, he's got everything, he's handsome, he's dashing, he's daring, he's the ideal man, that kind of thing. She's just smitten with him, and she tries so hard, and in her grief, instead of just being like, I can't have this man, because he straight up says, no, I'm like, this is not going to happen, and he spurns her often and repeatedly. And so what she does is she tries to show him that she takes on male characteristics and becomes, a warrior. and goes on and kills the one of the big bads, the Witch King. So this wraith type thing, if you've seen the movie, she stabs it right in the face. And that's not the end of her journey, because she gets wounded there and ends up finding a suitable love out of that, and learns the value of I guess feminine virtue through the action of masculine virtue, and her with regard to her relationship to another character, Faramir. And so these different, I guess, approaches to feminine virtue and to feminine action really tell us a different story. And I think the juxtaposition helps, because one of them is the story of Rome. This is what a woman, a noble woman, this is what a woman would do in this situation if she's spurned and has no recourse. And in this is kind of what a woman in our society would do. They lash out in a certain way, and they come around and learn a greater lesson. And which kind of also shows a maturity in our storytelling as well, because Lord of the Rings itself is the myth of our society in so many ways, and that's why it resonates so hard with so many people in our society, and they don't know why. Why is this such an important thing? Why is this such an important story? Why do we keep talking about it ad nauseum? Why do we reference it? Why are there so many memes? And then, and I think, and I made this, and I've had this in my head a while, but the one of the core philosophies that constructs Lord of the Rings is found in the end of the book, where the actions of the smallest member of society have an effect on the entire society, and the smallest person can have the greatest impact. And that's what happens in the story. You have literally the smallest people, this representative of idealism and almost soft democratic society in the Hobbits, where they are these, chubby little puffballs of non-conflict, literally. He sets that up in the books, and then he sends 4 of them out on the most grueling thing ever to try literally everything about them, and they save the world for a time. And this is a reflection of what we see our society wanting to be. Everyone can make a difference. Everyone has some role to play, and these are ideals that we want, and we get this out of this. It's like, and it's more than just like, well, if he can do it, I can too. Those asinine little things where they show you somebody without a leg running a marathon, and it's like, it's good for them, but like, that's not an inspiring story. An inspiring story is something that's couched in the meaning, and it's couched in the logos, which Lord of the Rings definitely is, which is why it resonates. And so this, like something like a Western, also resonates with it. And that's very, well, as Lord of the Rings is very British, I would say the Western and even the samurai movie is very an American thing. Yeah. Because you have this person who's going out on their own to make use of their own skills to survive a hostile world, using just what's on their back, which is very American story. What are you going to do? Well, I'm going to go west and do what? Probably die, but I will be the one to kill me in the labor of farming.
I think that's sort of the purpose and the undertone. Like the superficiality of the story, I think, is less important than the actual conflict or conflicts of interest that they deal with during that journey. Do you know what I mean? Well, to me, the myths are more important to have as some sort of launch off point for rumination, right? So I don't know much about Lord of the Rings, so I can't really refer to those specifically. But similar stories, like you're familiar with the Trojan War. And the myth to the start of the Trojan War is all about like Zeus throwing a party, and then like Eris isn't invited, so a golden apple gets thrown into the ring that says "for the fairest" or "for the most beautiful" or something like that.
Yeah, and
then there's like 3 of the gods fighting over who's the most. Like, if you're a god, you don't care who's the most beautiful, first of all, and second of all, Hera is like their mother, so.
Well, you do if you're the Greek gods, because they're created like that. They're like, I'm not just the personification of good. I'm also the personification of certain, darker aspects of humanity.
It's intrinsically human for people to fight over insane things and then cause like this giant calamity afterwards because it gets so blown out of proportion. Like, the metaphysics of the metaphysics, I think, is what really makes it stand the test of time, and why people sing and write about it, is because these are things that we do within our own, within our families even, never mind friendships and work relationships and everything. It's like a daily grind where we're constantly having apples thrown into the room and we're all fighting over scraps when it's not even important. And those things get blown out of hand. And specifically, like, I would think that story of Zeus throwing a wedding, not inviting somebody, and then somebody throwing the apple of discord and just to screw things up, is gossip. And it's not like they're outright saying, like, we're talking about gossip here and you shouldn't gossip about your coworkers. But the story itself, it makes people, it resonates in a way that is familiar to people who have had those types of engagements with other human beings. Right. So what I think the important part of mythology isn't specifically that the stories are interesting and fun and exciting or, epic. It's the fact that they make you think deeply about like everyday things, but they do it in a way that's so interesting that you don't realize that you're dealing with those deeper subjects.
Right, because if you look closely into that, I'm going to elaborate here. If you look closely at that particular story, the question is asked of 3 goddesses. Was it Minerva? Not Minerva.
I think it was Hera, Aphrodite, and
Athena. And so
Athena,
one of them, and they
Athena was offering wisdom, and Aphrodite was offering
they
Helen.
all offer different aspects of success and like worldly success. You can have,
you can be a warrior. You can have the love of your life and have nothing, or you can have reign over an entire dominion or something.
Yeah, and
like
I think one of them was like wisdom.
That was Athena.
Yeah.
But she said the wisest warrior, basically, because that was the only purpose for wisdom back then, was to kill people.
Paris chose wrongly and started a war.
But he chose humanly. Humans do that all the time.
Which is what most of those stories are about, and which is why we still tell them, and why they still like, yeah, that makes sense. And everyone's like, well, the stories are old, and they, they're so basic, and they're not basic. But we have derived so much from them, and we reference them. They have become
but it's the depth of them that's important, in my opinion. And it's because these stories are tricking people into thinking about things that are hard to think about that they would otherwise just avoid. Most people don't just sit there and meditate on existentialism and metaphysics and stuff as a point of fun, right? But when you give them a story that's fun and the kids can act it out and people can play music to it, and you can go to a theater or a play, or you can sit in your cove and have coffee and read it. Like, there's so many ways to take part in it. What's the word for to receive it? There's so many different ways of actually receiving the same story that it forces people subliminally to think about deeply subconscious issues that we struggle with as human beings in a social environment or as a cultural species. And storytelling through this type of abstraction, I think, is the reason why we have this part of our brain, is because without it, we would either contemplate reality constantly and get nothing done for our entire lives because it would be so fascinating to us, or we'd never think of it at all. And this sort of helps find that gray balance in between. And I think religion serves that purpose a lot too, because in religious texts, the whole point of the religious text isn't for you to memorize verses and like have laws written in stone, literally, even though they were written in stone as, part of the stories. The point of the stories was always abstraction. And the point of it was always to make it more memorable and easier to digest intellectually.
Yeah.
Without scaring people away, and then also having to give them direction in their lives in the process. So it's not just dealing with the conflict and having no resolve. It's also telling what the ideal outcome should be, or what you should strive for, or the idea of perfection. And then it's always forgiving people for being imperfect.
Well, no, that last part, everything up to that last clause was correct, I would say, because the Greek myths do not let you get away with being imperfect. In fact, they say, oh, you're imperfect. And the Christians do this too. You have original sin. You can forgive you for being imperfect, but you're not going to get away with it. And they, whenever humans act without imperfection or think they're not imperfect, the Greek gods just slam the hammer down on them.
But that's not entirely accurate, though, because when God created humans, he said, like, specifically after he kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden, you guys are imperfect. And all of humanity is imperfect, and that's the whole reason Jesus came down. So if you don't take the word for word literally and you look at what the actions are of the stories, the fact that God would split himself into another thing to experience humanity and then forgive people's sins by suffering the worst possible pain you could imagine, that's evidence and proof that they're not to get out of it, but there is a forgiveness for people's imperfections, and there's an expectation that nobody is perfect, because only the Son of God lived that life that was perfect. And even Jesus's life, he doubted God. Like 3 times or something. And this is the same with like Muhammad. He preached submission and peace and love, but he also went to war and slaughtered people in the name of God because they were offending him, just like David in the Bible, in the Jewish Bible and everything, in the Torah or whatever. But like every tradition has this where there's a juxtaposition between, or a dichotomy, between good and evil, but the entire book and the entire doctrine is talking about the gray area, but not directly. It's always indirectly. They'll explicitly say the black and white, but what the purpose of the entire volume is the gray area, even though they're not talking about it directly.
Because if you tell someone something directly, they'll tell you to, tell you where to go. But, you need to do this, and they're like, neat. But you need to show them why they need to do that. They need to, like, it's like not putting the right ingredients into a recipe and seeing it come out, and you're like, oh, okay, I get it. I'm never going to make this mistake again. Or you'll do when you're tired, but you'll put the right amount of ingredients in. But it's because we don't know things literally. We don't know things discreetly. We know things within constructs of everything we can see, and we learn things with regard and reference to other things. We can't not, because everything's connected. And I do want to kind of get into what makes what's the difference between like a story and a myth. But well, I think you said everything that needed to be said there.
Well, there was one other thing too. I was also trying to make another point with the way that we adopt religions as part of our cultures and heritages. It's because of, like I was talking about before, the subliminal affect of it that creates or generates that type of need for thought that we otherwise would be foregoing. But it's also a community development thing. So regular stories are fun and interesting, but a myth that you actually live your life by, not necessarily out of strict belief, but just the fact that you've heard it so much and it's part of your culture and the way you speak and the turns of phrases that you use to abbreviate complex thoughts because they're uniformly accepted and understood between peoples. I think as a form of communication, myths are really important. And language is like the biggest part of our intelligence as a species too. So being that we're social species and we communicate very articulately, having some type of metaphysical reference to discuss things that are hard to discuss between bodies of intelligence, I think that's super important too, with like trying to segue into what is a myth or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a better way of saying what you were trying to say before. And because life, the key about it is that, reality itself and reality itself is complex to a degree that the combined minds of our species have merely graced the surface of its complexity. And then even our own perspective within that is infinitely complex. And so we need these devices. And I hate saying it like this because it kind of makes it, religion is just a device by which we live by. But it's more than that, because within that we have evolved in a way evolutionarily. Now there is one of the Sapkowski evolutionary biology lectures gets into the evolutionary biology of religion, and it's been a while since I watched it, and I should have watched it before I got into today's podcast, but here we are. And there's a growing talk within those circles of the fact that there is a biological aspect. So we are constructed with regard to, and this is kind of why atheism is kind of a weird thing, and atheism manifests in the way it does. But religion is a biologically manifested thing, and we do this, and this is essentially what we're talking about, and you put it very well just a moment ago in a different way, I think. But
there's even a part of the brain that's for it. I think it's like the parietal lobe or something like that. Like there's an actual physical center of the brain that a lot of drugs even stimulate, like ayahuasca and LSD and things like that, and psilocybin, like give people religious
DMT stream.
What's that?
We should do a DMT stream. Live stream. We're taking ayahuasca. Let's go. That maybe we would do it and then not post it.
It would be scientifically ignorant to ignore religion in general, not just for the culture, and not just for the language, and not just for the importance of tradition and family values and the things that bring us together through religious
experience.
But denying that would actually cripple your brain. You'd have to do something else with it, and you'd start adopting other myths just because that's how your brain works.
Right, and which is why
developing types of OCDs like don't step on cracks.
Okay. Good. I know where I want to go. But you
can wait for me.
No. I need to wait. I need to wait a few minutes for this. Sorry. I'm just happy I know where I want to go now. Sorry. But it's that portion of the brain, like you mentioned, is
should
there.
Look that up actually.
Yeah. And because there is documented religious euphoria, religious experience across every culture, back to like the shamanist traditions up into even modern Christianity has religious fervor. And it's a state of mind that you get in where you seem to just be in contact with reality, with God, with the gods, with whatever. And this happens a lot to everybody of every religion, even the atheists. And it's a moment of contact, I would say, in the most plain sense with the logos. You're understanding your position, and you're understanding the glory. A lot of times you can get this very simply. You don't need drugs for it. Just go stand at the base of a mountain and look at it. You get that nuministic experience, that feeling. We've used this before. You look at the Hubble Space Telescope pictures and you get a sense of the grandeur of the numinous of, the universe. There's an aspect of the gods there, and there's an aspect of this. And it's not like, well, I believe that the universe was created by God. It's like, it doesn't matter what you believe. There is almost spiritualism.
It's the periaqueductal gray, by the way. They used to think it was the parietal lobes, but they found a different spot.
Put a picture of that in the in that spot. But the spiritual experience, I would say, is a way of engaging reality. And every iteration of religion and through these experiences, through these storytellings, brings us to a more representative spirituality, which I guess would be to say that we have our stories represent better what reality is. Our stories are better suited to doing what you were explaining before, kind of like these, you read the story, oh man, I'm feeling a lot like, this, and you reference a certain story or whatever. And that iterative process over time has left us with this, but we also have technology. Now, before we get into that, I want to get into the fact that I claim that the atheists and atheism is a religion, just like Christianity, just like Buddhism, just like Islam. It's the same thing.
Not a religion. It can be, but
there's religious aspects, just kind of like religious Taoism and philosophical Taoism. Don't drink the poison.
Well, it's like saying science is a religion, though. Philosophy is just a process of thought through reason and logic.
You bring that up because science, religious science, and we're seeing it a lot in
homeopathy and astrology, and
they invoke the name of science without knowing what it is. It's literally just a method for engaging the world. Like, what is this? I don't know. Poke it. And did you write it down? Good. That's called science now. And that's it. But we invoke it. Now the atheists have, there's like a lot of atheists out there that will claim that there's no God, there's only reality, there's only objective reality. Okay. There's a lot we don't understand. And there's so much we don't understand, but that's not an argument for God either. But the way they go about their atheism, they have their own gods. They're creating their own, mysterium and they have their holy books, and they have their saints, and they have their religious experiences, and they have their things that go, because they're the only way to start explaining the world in a non-religious way for humans is to tell it in a religious way, to make a myth that doesn't involve God. And that's why atheism is kind of cheap, because it's just like, oh, I'm denying God. It's like, cool, you tried to explain the universe by denying one aspect of it. But
it's no different from saying there is God, though. So that's what makes them a religion. It's the fact that it relies on faith, that there is no God, when agnosticism would specifically say we don't know. There may or may not be one. Right. So agnosticism is not a religion, but atheism is, because there's a blind belief, which is the word faith, that there is no God. There can't be a God, or they're sure of it. You know what I mean? So the difference here being, though, with something like Buddhism, you don't have to pray to Buddha. Like, there is no right or wrong Buddhism. Whereas every other religion, there are very strict rules to say you must believe in Christ to be Christian, right? You must believe in tradition to be Confucianism or whatever. So I'd say even Confucius's philosophies are religious because of the traditions and rituals. Whereas I would contrast that with an atheist sort of following like Marvel myths and movies and Hollywood and things like that. They're creating stories and heroes, and they're using the same processes. They just don't realize, because they're not self-aware. Right. So it's basically like a childish version of religion, where they're not prepared to study or learn something that's well thought out and complicated and messy. They just want to scrap it all and have the easiest possible way of thinking. And that, to me, is why religion is so important and why it's persisted through the ages. Because with religion, you're forcing people to think when they otherwise wouldn't.
Yeah, and you brought up one thing. You brought up you're talking about the Marvel movies, and I want to belabor that a bit, because it's good content. But no, it's a good way. It's a good way to get into it, because you get you don't believe in God, okay? So, or you're not going to read the Bible, so you're going to go watch Star Wars. You're going to go watch Marvel movies, and you see people engaging in this activity where they it's kind of a weird thing that people do, and I think it can be explained where the action of like people engaging too hard into the lore of something,
fanfare,
getting into the fandom, getting into the lore, and this is the religious tendency that I need to know the canon. I need to know what's going on. I need to know the story. I need to know all the people associated with it. I need to know, I need to memorize the Star Wars wiki or whatever, because, and we did this in one. I worked with a guy at a paint store, and he wasn't a bad guy. He just loved Star Wars. That was his religion. And he lived by it, actually, quite, he took the lessons of, the Jedi to heart, and it kind of gave him direction in life, and it was his thing. And he would like quiz us on like Star Wars trivia, and it was fun for us, and it was fun for him, but it was his religion. And I think that's what I mean by the new gods. Luke Skywalker was a god to him. It doesn't exist, and it didn't need to exist. And that's the fascinating part about it, is that we don't really need our gods to be real anymore, which I think is absolutely fascinating.
And if you sit and think, they never were. People adopt them because there are extremes in all cases. Anytime you say or do something, there's going to be an extreme on one end, an extreme on the other, and then the majority of people are going to be in between somewhere, right? So some people take that fanaticism and they would take it what some would call too far. I don't care what people do. So if somebody wants to be really into Lord of the Rings lore or like the Witcher lore or anything like that, all power to them. If there's an apocalypse, those people would be so well suited to tell stories around a campfire. And we absolutely need that for community building and stuff. So having people that know these stories that well is actually useful in a social sense, right? Because it's like a backup plan or an insurance plan for community development, right?
Right.
As long as we have TV and stuff, we don't really need these fanatics, but eventually you might. And thankfully there's a small percentage of people that get that deeply into it. But there are a small percentage of people who get that deeply into religion too. Not everybody who runs around and believes in a certain thing does the exact same thing as everybody else.
Right.
Not everybody takes the word of God literally. Most people who are devout Christian or whatever will claim that they take it literally, but in practice in their everyday life, they absolutely don't. Because if you really understood eternal damnation, you would be so afraid of doing anything in your life just to avoid hell. You wouldn't do anything. And people go out and make mistakes and get messy all the time. So clearly they don't actually deeply appreciate how infinities work.
I don't think that's giving them enough credit, honestly. And
eternity is a very, very long time. Nothing in your life would be more important than avoiding eternal anything bad.
Well,
you'd never lie. You'd never swear.
They rely on the forgiveness aspect of it, but I still think that's not giving them enough credit, because one of the things that I meant by that was that when Christianity was at its height, the Christian world didn't just believe that God existed. And a lot of the Christians nowadays don't just believe. That is the way the world is to them. And I think that's a better way of looking at religious people. To a Hindu, it's not just, oh, this is the God I follow. Well, they still say that because that's the way we say it, but they see the world like that. Now, I can't see, and we can't really, both of us, I don't think, can see the world like that because we're
I grew up like that.
Right. But
I know most Christians don't read the Bible. And if you actually believe that God wrote it, nothing would be more important. You'd never read anything else. That's all you would read. But people read bits and pieces of the Bible because fundamentally, deep down, they know that it's a mythology that helps them.
No,
and it's not to say it's right or wrong. It just means it's imperfect. It can't be perfect. If it's physically in this world, it can't possibly be perfect.
Right. Well, yeah. Yeah. But what I'm saying is that the interesting part of it isn't the adherence to it at all. I don't really care about adherence to it. The interesting part is the fact that we've replaced that aspect, the belief that explains the universe, which is the way the Greeks and the Christians did it, with something a lot different, with something that we've kind of clipped off an aspect of mythology and taken almost its vital essence of what makes a mythology and distilled it into just maybe even democratic creativity, where come up with a story. If people like it, they'll do it. If there's meaning in it, people will keep reading it. If there's well, that meaning will carry it through history, so to speak. And
I think it's that subtext that makes it compelling, though. Like without that deep subtext,
right,
we're not compelled to want to know it or follow it. You know,
and
like,
I think that universality that we talked about earlier, and like you get that aspect of it, and I think that's a good lead into the thing, because someone said recently, and I'm sorry I can't remember who said it. It just kind of, someone said it in a podcast randomly like a couple weeks ago, and I don't remember who it was. You can't write a myth, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you can't write a myth. You don't just sit down and write a myth. No one can do that. That's not how they're done.
Well, Stan Lee was pretty good at it.
Stan Lee was, well, let's get into this, because you can't write a myth, but the selection of stories turns those stories into myths. So over time, stories get turned into myths. Shakespeare wasn't writing myths, but the constant mulling over, the constant taking of his tropes and characters and people turned it into a myth. It encountered, the story itself encountered reality and was adopted by, as part of the,
But he also brought in like fairies and jesters and all types of.
Oh yeah, well, he like half of the words we use were invented by Shakespeare. It's not half, but a lot.
Yeah, but not just his invention, but I mean like the Tempest and stuff. Weren't there like woodland nymphs and?
Yeah, he was playing off of. He was also like, he wasn't inventing that up from scratch.
That's what I mean. He was taking stories from existing myths.
Yeah, and that's actually a good example of that, because he was taking existing stories, putting them in, and that the fact that they're continued turns them into a mythology. And I think what makes it a mythology is that it has that element of an extended and adopted themes and adopted ideas, but it also has an aspect of it that it was written by someone who was engaging with the logos without blinders on, without, they were engaging honestly with reality, is kind of a way I want to say it. And I don't think everyone can do that. I think Shakespeare was special. I think the people that made up Homer were special. I think Virgil was special. And I think, honestly, people like,
even theoretical physicists of today who are practicing actual science also engage in the same type of practice when they discuss like the holographic principle of information being stored on the surface of black holes and things like that, or like the Big Bang itself. Like for the bang to occur, time must occur, but time was created within the Big Bang.
And so they're telling themselves a story and they're like looking at the math going, what the, how the?
Yeah, and we're just still trying to figure it out, but we create stories just like particles and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and like superposition and entanglement and quantum tunneling. Like there are all kinds of actual sciences where we describe, and we still use myths to outline how it works.
You could argue science is just the most boring story that's representative of reality. It's not a fun story to tell.
I think it's the most fascinating. It's
fascinating. It's not a good story to listen to, but once you
I love it. Theoretical physicists have the best lectures. Like Leonard Susskind and Sean Carroll, and they're all fantastic speakers. Max Tegmark, he's awesome.
But most people aren't you.
No, I know. But
I think the thing is, I'm saying like explaining how a line works isn't going to be like, it's going to be fascinating, but it's not going to give you that religious experience. Now, Carl Sagan would say that it's not the science itself that gives you the religious experience. It's, there's still that numinous with regard to science. It's your encounter with something. Like you look at a galaxy and you're like, you could stare at all like a galaxy, a picture, like a high resolution picture of a galaxy forever, but understanding what it is brings you into relation to that. And when you're in relation, when you understand the reality of it that science has given us, that sorry, let's just not say that. That scientists using the scientific method have given us. You understand that like it is something worth, reality itself is something worth being, having, that can give you a religious experience, but the math itself doesn't. But
it does though, because it translates to metaphors. Like when we talk about space-time continuum being a fabric of space-time, the only way we can describe it, even in mathematical terms, is using tensors that describe cloth simulations, right? Mm-hmm. Like we use the same types of imagery and metaphors to replace reality. In our language, but also in our science. And as we describe things, we generate stories to describe how things move and interact, even with having math for like quarks and protons and antimatter and stuff. We need stories to know why there's no symmetry.
But I don't think the data itself is the story. I think the data itself is the signal. And I think
that's what I'm getting at. We generate the story.
No, hold on. I think that the story, I think that the religious experience that you can find in it, the mythology, because doing the work of science is very, very similar to a meditation. And I think encountering that is where it lies, not in the thing in itself.
Right. So what I'm saying is the description, though, of the science, of the discoveries, and of the quantifiable, measurable things, the descriptions of them, the way that they're expressed in journal articles or in treatises or theses or whatever, and the way those are projected into hypotheses are myths. The hypotheticals of information theory never being erased, right? Or black holes evaporating, or just like the end of time, the big rip, the big crunch with the universe either expanding forever or contracting into nothing. So, those explanations are stories of what's going to happen based on a creation of mythology. Without the gods and without all of that, what we're describing is an interaction with energy and matter that's quantifiable, that creates a consciousness that can contemplate it. So like the universe being the eye that sees itself, and like creating eyes like humans to have consciousness just to observe itself.
It's kind of like in there was this group in Babylon 5, that show I like, where they said like essentially that, where the universe people are the universe trying to understand itself, which is a neat way of looking at it.
But it's a common theme though, because that is basically tantamount to the Tao, or the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost.
Well,
I've been using Arjuna and Shiva and Ganesh.
That's what I mean by logos. Like when I say logos, I'm using that as a synonym for Tao, for the way, for these, like the interaction between you and the world. And when you're going down the way, the path, you will be in accord because you're going along with reality. And when you're working against reality, your myth's going to be wrong. And I think that's where you get bad myths, like movies that just don't click, where you watch them and you're just like, that had no bearing on reality, or that was just a bunch of stuff that happened. We've all watched movies or read books where just like stuff happened, it had no bearing on anything. It was just like, it wasn't exactly Shakespeare, or it's just, basic didactic, like we're going to count to 10 stuff, but which is shallow attempts at coaching things in stories, like I'm talking Sesame Street. But
what's important to note is that they're not different or separate. Like even our science contains myths that are still current today that people believe in. And this is getting back to what you were talking about with the atheists or whatever.
Right.
They have this blind belief that things are figured out, or they're capable of being figured out. And there are intrinsically things in nature that can't be known. You can't know the speed and position of a subatomic particle at any given point in time.
As far as we know, I don't think...
No, it doesn't physically exist, because particles are just points in a field. The field is what exists.
Well,
and we can measure a field by finding one point, but you can't measure its speed if it's stopped.
Right. But there are things that science is given, and like a lot of stuff, that reproducible effects in the universe that
and this is what I'm trying to explain.
A story.
You
that's
keep cutting
just
me off.
Right, because
the double slit experiment is proof that observation changes physical reality. So when you shine a light through two slits on a wall, it produces a wave pattern. If you look at the particle, if you shoot them one at a time, they will produce dots on the screen, but over time, all of those dots aggregated together will again create the interference pattern of a wave. But if you look at it on the other side, you actually collapse the waveform. The field stops acting like a wave field and becomes discrete. It becomes a point just from observing it.
Are you gonna,
because a photon has to hit that thing and come back to you for you to actually observe.
Are you going to argue that that means that the world is subjective?
What's that?
I don't know. Go on. Sorry.
But that's what I was trying to get at, though.
I don't know
Even
where
the
you're going with
science
that.
has demonstrable proof that's reproducible through experiments and a bunch of experiments that it's not deterministic. What happens?
We don't know why that does that, though. Like,
that is metaphysical. That becomes a mythology then. If things are like,
well, the hypothesis becomes the story then, because like it's just a hypothesis that as to why that happens, or even if that's happening at all. We don't know why that happens.
Well, we
Scientists
do, because there are fields, and when you interact with a field, it collapses the probabilistic wave pattern into a discrete point. That's the science.
Right, but we don't know why the observation itself makes that happen. We
do, because to observe something, you need an interaction for it to come back and have a sensor be shut off. The only way to interact with anything is by using the smallest possible subatomic particle and then detecting it back when it interacts.
Okay.
So the thing is, there are reproducible patterns like this because you can use like sheets of gold and blast lasers and see it tunnel through the other side of a gold sheet. And you can quantifiably measure and predict how many will go through based on the density of the material that you're shooting at it. So like the science itself tells you that the universe is non-discrete until it's observed.
Right, but how does the observation itself, how does this observation itself get into...
I'm trying to explain that. The mythology of the science then is to say that the Big Bang then creates things to have consciousness to observe itself. Essentially, that's what it's getting down to. That's the only possible conclusion that you can draw based on the science alone without a mythology, is to create a mythology of it. Like it's self-inventing, it's recursive.
I don't know. I think I'd need to see the mechanism again. I need to see the experiment. I need to look at it again to make a judgment on that.
Well, I'm not asking for a judgment. I'm saying that there are mythologies in science, and people who think that mythologies are wrong because of science don't know science. Science develops mythologies too.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. Well, we have, the science is a nexus for that, because you have, look at Galileo might be a good example of this, where he's like, his data shows this, and everyone's like, no, it contradicts my story. And it's like, well, we're allowed to tell more than one story at a time. And they're like, no, off with his head. But that's not what they did or said. But
well, they did threaten him.
Yeah. And so I think he just went into exile for a while.
He was threatened several times.
Oh yeah, exile's not.
But he was even doing dialogues. Like he wasn't even outright saying that the church was wrong. He was doing it like subtly through stories, again through a mythology, and trying to get to a deeper truth.
Yeah, and for those listening, exile isn't a light thing. It's like, oh, they just sent him somewhere else. It's like, yeah, but somewhere else usually means you don't have access to anything.
Yeah, sanitation, food, shelter, police, like nothing.
Yeah.
And then you're a barbarian if you go to another civilized society, right? So like they'll treat you like an outcast or a third class citizen or whatever.
Travel was discouraged in the ancient world. Okay, so one thing I wanted to get in, and I was trying to get into it, was that like we tell ourselves stories, and I think I do want to make a distinction between just stories and myth, because everyone tells stories, but it doesn't make it a mythology essentially, because there's a lot of bad storytellers out there, and I want to kind of get into that and what makes something fail as a mythology.
Wasn't that what we were talking about though, with the underlying depth to the story? That's what made it mythology and not a story.
You kind of went into science though, and I didn't really know where you were going.
Well, you had mentioned religion and atheism, and science is the reason for atheists. And science also has mythologies. That's what I was pointing out.
Right. So what I wanted to get at, though, was kind of looking at the stories we're telling ourselves nowadays with regard to like more popular myths that we're trying to tell each other. So you get stuff like how do I put this? Let's see here. So let me start again. So the question I wanted to get into was why, when someone tells a story, does the story just not hit? So someone puts all their heart and soul into a story. Someone makes a movie and there's dozens of people involved and they put it out and it's got all the markers of what should make a good story and it just kind of flops. It, you know, we see this with something like the Star Wars movies that are recently come out, where you get the first movie was a myth that relied on tropes that had come before. You get elements of modern World War II myths. You get elements of, you know, good and evil, which come into it. The way things are right and wrong, how to had elements of Eastern mythology in there. And it all kind of came together with regard to kind of a Campbellian hero's journey, which drove the narrative, and everyone just watched it and was like, I get it. And they ate it up and they watched it again and again and again and became household gods of many people. And then they made more of them. And people,
I think it's the way they engineered them, though. They made them formulaic. There was no complexity or depth or artistry to it. It was just like, we need a character to do this. We need a side plot to do this. We need a joke here. We need a sidekick here.
Yeah.
Like they just put pieces together and threw it out and said, we'll make money on this because of the branding. Right. Like the original Star Wars had depth. You were rooting for terrorists and you had like, you know, a giant empire, which was supposedly trying to spread peace across the galaxy. Who's the evil villain? So like there was complexity in the nature of the construction of the story. Right. It wasn't just the characters being good or bad, right or wrong, and, you know, evil doers.
We have an easily recognizable system of injustice. Then you have some people who are just kind of choosing to, not even forced into it. They're
drawn into it through destiny.
They're drawn into it, the call of adventure, as Campbell would say. And he follows the hero's journey quite closely. And one of the things I think that's happening, you brought that up, is like you kind of hinted at it, is like you have like a committee doing it. There's just, you know, do this, because you can't. And that's one of the things that I find fascinating as well, is that you can't just put all the pieces together and say, you know, it's not a stew. You can't just like throw a piece here. Oh, we need a bit of this. You need a few member berries, and you need to have, you know, this kind of imagery here. And we want to have this. And then we got to stick in a bit of our message, and then poof, you have a movie. Now anyone can make a movie. I could go outside with my cell phone right now and make a movie. I could like make props out of anything and just like call it a movie. It would be a movie. It's a film if I made it long enough, and it would be terrible. But I think that belies the fact that it's a lot more complicated than that long iterative process of discussing over the proverbial campfire as to, you know, telling the story over and over and over again. And I think why I come to the individual as talking about like Shakespeare, or the genius, or the person of talent, the special person who can see what's going on, is that person has a singular idea of how to bring the story or manifest a story from what was. And so, essentially, you can imagine it in a metaphor of the campfire again. You can say, there's a bunch of people sitting around a campfire, and when someone says, oh, well, then I'm going to make Hercules have another horse, and he's going to stand on the horse, and everyone's just like, shut up, that's dumb. And some guy's been sitting there for a couple hours going, okay, I've got an idea. And then he just tells the story, and he just kind of let it flows out of them, and they let him tell it, and it's amazing. And you have that, I guess the telling itself would be a religious experience of sorts. But what's happening is a lot of the stuff, and I'm getting this from something I've noticed, is that all the stuff that I really like, all the stuff that I've really enjoyed, all the media that I've just, been drawn into without any effort, is stuff that when you look at the production of it, they just kind of let them do their thing. And I find that very interesting, because you get like all the books I like, or the video games, you see this in like I guess the new Star Wars series that comes out. You get this one series, The Mandalorian, which was really good. There's a bit of message in there, but it's still really good storytelling. And what happened was they just kind of let them do. They didn't know why it was just a side project, and everyone already, it clicked with everyone in society for a short time. And the people up the head didn't know why, because they had all this other projects going on and nobody liked them. And what happened was they just let someone tell a story. And what's happening there is someone's plugging themselves in to that, and they're able to see reality, and they're telling the story with regard to what they see, or maybe not even what they see. They're not trying to tell something explicit. They're just trying to tell a story, and they don't even know. I don't even think the story, what the lessons of the story are consciously being said. And I think that's the thing. They're just trying to say something, and they don't know what it is. And this is what it comes out as. And everyone's like, I don't know what that is either. But they read it, and they read it, and read it, and they do it. And the ones that hit are the ones that stay and become mythology. And this happens. And I think that aspect of it, maybe you could call it love, is what makes the mythology manifest itself.
I think what makes art is the imperfection in the artist. So when you have one person doing something, their imperfections can manifest as something that's even greater than they intended originally to produce. But when you have too many people together, they start correcting each other's imperfections, and then the story is bland.
Too many cooks in the kitchen.
It falls flat because there's no character to the characters. You know what I mean?
Right. And that's, one person has one thing that they're trying to be like, I don't know what I'm saying, and I gotta get it out. So having
an engineered, formulaic type of story is a way of making something like just flat bread.
Or if you get too many cooks in the kitchen, what happens is everyone wants to put their little slice of truth into it, and like one person at a time. And that, like, and one of the things I find interesting is that this works, I guess, to scale. So think of a movie production company. You have a guy, and he's got an idea. I don't know, think Stanley Kubrick or something. And he makes a movie. I want to tell the story of a guy in Hal, or a guy going into space. And he's got this vision. And Stanley Kubrick was notoriously like, someone come up to him, and if he didn't have time for you, he would let you know that he didn't have time for you. He was not one to take fools lightly. And he had a vision. How many
people understand the monoliths in his movie?
So he get it. But the thing is that everyone in the production crew would have had their own vision. So think of the what do you call them? The wardrobe people. We've got to make all the costumes and the space suits and the laser guns or whatever. There weren't laser guns in there, but whatever. And the people who make models, they all have their little area, and they're being creative within that area. And so it's like, you have to do this, but they're not contributing to the overarching scheme of what the idea is. Because if you get that, someone comes in and say, oh, we should talk about, the civil rights movement that's happening or something like that. And it's like, no, I want to tell a story about, humanity evolving into something greater with regard to the rest of the cosmos and blah, 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 blah. And that's discarded. You get one story, but within that story, people can still be creative. So the wardrobe person can add their genius to that wardrobe thing. They can make, they can be creative within their own realm. They're influencing the whole, but they're working as king of their own kingdom within the empire of, 2001, The Space Odyssey, which is a weird metaphor. I'm sorry, I'm mixing metaphors here because I'm kind of.
But the thing is, to your point, to sort of like put a pin on it, if you had more than one director, they definitely wouldn't have had those monolith scenes where you spend 10 minutes with monkeys dancing around a big black brick, because most people would have said that just throw that out. We have a long enough movie as it is. It's already a 2.5 hour movie. Why? Like we don't.
It's 3 hours, but there's not much talking. Like it's a sit and think about it movie.
And that's the thing. So because Kubrick could do it on his own, he got to include things like that we wouldn't understand until long after it was produced.
Mm-hmm.
Or that we could discuss at least long after it was produced. Whereas if you have too many directors, all those little imperfections, like I hated those scenes, they were so annoying to me. But all of those little imperfections would get wiped out, and then you end up with just something bland. Completely flavorless, no personality. It's just this happened, this happened, this happened.
Another Kubrick
but like with Star Wars, you
be...
get complicated characters like Han Solo, like a smuggling, arms dealer who murders people, and like he's a womanizer. He's not a good guy, but he becomes the hero.
But he's a good guy.
Yeah. But
and
that's the conflict in all of us, because every person deems themselves good, but every person does wrong things.
Right.
At least at some point.
I honestly think you're hitting a nail on the head, but I think you're hitting a completely different nail. It's a weird way to say it, but because you hit, and I think you hit two nails actually, which was the first one being, you get something like, if we look at Kubrick again, we look at Barry Lyndon, and you see his flavor. And that's kind of what you were saying, I think. And you see with Barry Lyndon, his movie was a lot more artsy. You definitely saw because a lot of the scenes in there were framed as if you're looking at a early modern painting. Or a Baroque painting or something like that. And it's a gorgeous movie, but within the gorgeous movie, there's a story of a man being told, and not a very good man, and this is the second nail that I'm going to get to, is that he's a very complex man. But to labor on the first point is that if you have someone else's vision coming in, it would be discordant, because he's trying to have a theme. He's trying to make it all it's trying to all stay in have the same feeling, have the same milieu, flow together from beginning to end. And if you have a note come in from outside going like, well, we should all brush our teeth, and everyone would be like, well, what was that? It's a stark thing. And we have this in movies. A lot of times you see this with propaganda, where all of a sudden you'll get the Communist Party coming in of China when they want to release a movie in there, and then and nothing happened here, or the character will take an aside in one of the new Disney movies. And my wife was saying is like the character in the Mulan movie, which my wife watched, and she said the character would just stop every once in a while and say something about the good of the group over the good of the individual, and just the plot would go on. But after that, what would happen was you get this discord, and people notice that because they're expecting this this flow of ideas that is related to each other. So when you read a book and all of a sudden there's a recipe for pancakes in it, you're going to notice everything has to flow together with the same theme, with the same mood, with the same, everything has to do it. And Kubrick was probably the best at this. Now, for the second point he did is in Barry Lyndon, which is an amazing story. It's a story about a guy who goes through his life. He's born in, I think it was Ireland, and he falls in love with a girl and makes a whole bunch of bad decisions, and then runs off and makes a whole bunch of more bad decisions. And then, grows up and is a complete jerk of a person and makes a whole bunch more bad decisions. And at the end of the movie, this horrible person, this person that you wouldn't want to associate with in real world, you are at once being like, what an awful guy, but you are sympathetic towards him and you understand the tragedy of this rakish fellow such that you feel bad for him. And this happens through an amalgamation of, lighting, story, music, costume, timing, framing. All this stuff comes together in the mind of the one creative person that's guiding the vision of all these people who are honestly working with that in regard, whether or not they're enjoying it. I heard Kubrick was kind of a prickly fellow. It doesn't matter, because the vision that came out of it transcended what the man itself. And I think with someone like on a more popular thing that you gave, specifically with the example of like Han Solo, where you got this guy who's just kind of living as a clandestine businessman in space and on a spaceship with lasers and anti-gravity and all this stuff that doesn't exist, and yet we don't care because that doesn't matter, which is actually something that's interesting to get into. But this, and I think this may be what you're getting into, is that even though he's this jerk of a fellow, we can still see elements of ourselves in that character. And I think that goes not just for Han Solo, but we can see elements ourselves. And I know I can see elements of myself in Luke Skywalker, in Darth Vader, in even people like Leia. Oh no, but Leia's a woman. You can't have, you can't understand the perspective of a woman. It's like, yeah, but elements of her personality are, things that I've seen in my own life.
But I think that's what makes all stories intriguing or compelling, is having
when they can do
characters
that.
like that.
Yeah.
And the point is, the difference between a good story and a bad story is one that we feel we can relate to, like something that compels us to keep wanting to know the character.
Yeah.
Or to be invested in their success emotionally, to actually care whether or not they achieve their goal. Or if they, tragedies, when they die at the end, it actually hurts because you wanted to see them succeed.
Yeah.
Shakespeare captured this in his characters, and I'm not a scholar on Shakespeare by any means, but he captured in the sense of, in the same way we do with modern day, like crime or drug or any of those types of, like The Sopranos or Power or The Wire and things like that. We capture the same types of Shakespearean tragedy within our characters, and that's what compels us to get to know the story and follow it.
Yeah.
And then once you've invested in the story and you know a whole bunch of background, like Tolkien's lore or The Witcher lore, once you're invested in the world and the universe that it's set in, all of a sudden everything around it becomes more interesting. So like with the Marvel universe and the DC crossovers and stuff, people who are really into comics are really into comics.
Yeah.
Like, most people are somewhere in between, but like there's enough fanfare around the actual the universe that they create out of lore, and understanding that and being like mentally or emotionally participant in it, I think is what it drives people to want to watch garbage, even because they love it so much.
You watch, and you bring up garbage, and I think that's really interesting, is because I've noticed myself do that, is that I'll watch something great, something that drives me in, like I don't know, I don't even need a, like
Kenshin. Kenshin just captured me, and I watched 140 episodes of a show just because I loved the opening salvo.
And then you watch something like Kenshin, and when you're younger, Kenshin's not a complex story, but it's got a lot of good themes in it. And when you're a teenager, those themes hit hard, and then you're like, I want more. And like you crave mythology. And that's the thing. That's one thing that's interesting about humanity, is it's not just a thing we do. It's something we crave. It's like an addiction, and you want more. You want another story. You want that feeling, that maybe that religious experience, or just that feeling of comprehension, that feeling of engaging with moral values. Even, I don't know, maybe it's all these things, but you want more and you crave it, so you'll go get junk food. And you're like, okay, what's related to this? I'll go watch, I don't know, something worse. Or one of the things is like, I remember watching like Star Trek or something, and then you go watch like some Star Trek knockoff, and you're just like, it's not the same, but it's
we
good.
Can mythologize anything too, like athletes and sports. Like we can mythologize teams, and the Rams just won the Super Bowl, so like, we're big Rams fans in this house.
This came out a little late, but we recorded this the day after the 2 days after the Super Bowl. So
yeah, but like my team for English football, the Premier League, is Liverpool, and they won it 2 years ago, and it's the first time in my lifetime I've seen them win too. So like,
I think it's pronounced soccer.
English football.
He hit me.
But the point is, our teams are now enshrined in our brains and our memories. Like we remember all the players, we remember all the big plays, we remember all the big goals, we remember like who won which trophy for when, through this type of like continuation of a story. And that's very similar to the mythology. And we do that with like not just sports and stuff, but we do it with athletes and their backgrounds. And
you could look at it
like you were talking about.
You could look at religion. You could look at it structurally in sports. Like, what does the mythology of sports do? If we explain it boring and structurally, it connects you to your community. And because, well, who's watching the Winnipeg Jets? Well, people in Winnipeg, and it connects everyone together. And so you have this story, and everyone's telling it, engaging it together, and they're literally engaging in it. Well, you're not playing. Well, no, but you're there, and you're there with other people, and you're there with the community. And this story, it's actually the best reality TV you could get. And don't watch any other reality TV but sports, because people are actually trying to get something, and then they do. And then they work within the rules, which every story has, to achieve a thing. And whether or not they do it, and then in the third period, and then he scored, but then they scored on us. The Jets are really bad for this. And then we got scored on in the last minute. Super bad at that. And then we had to go to overtime, and we lost in overtime, and everyone in the city is just like, oh, and everyone's telling everyone, and everyone has something in common now, structurally. And we tell each other a story, maybe because it's the only story we have to tell that day, maybe because it's something to talk about and fill the awkward silence. And it's all of these things. It builds community. Myths build community. But
it also forces us to think about those deeper questions. And it's a lot like music. Like an album and a superstar musician is often mythologized. So like you'll find really, really big fans of like Phil Collins or Genesis or whatever, right?
Yeah, why do people die at 29? It's some metaphysical bullshit.
I don't get the depth to it, but doesn't matter. The point is, there are groupies and people who mythologize even music creators and their stories and their backgrounds, and within the lyrics of the songs that they sing, they're describing those deeper values without explicitly saying them outright. Like you've got music like "I cheated on you, I'm so sorry." Like it's really shallow.
Well, and that's the thing. Shallow music belies the fact that the stars themselves are the gods. And I remember listening to a lecture in Eastern religion class that he essentially said that like the Hindus just can make gods out of nothing. They can just, this person's a god, that person's a god, and they treat actors a lot of times, like Bollywood actors, as gods, and they'll have like a picture of their favorite Bollywood actor that they love, in like literally love, in their shrine with all the other gods, because they see that as some sort of nexus of power. Okay, that's just getting too metaphysical about it, but
Jackie Chan in China, he's huge.
Yeah. And you have this, but when you look at the power some of these people have, and that they're exercising even now, these celebrities, is that they're acting like gods, and they have godly power to just say, I say this, and people will listen because they are, word comes from on high. And Hollywood and the music industry are leveraging this. I don't know if knowingly or not, but they don't need the songs to be good. They need their gods to be interesting, and they're leveraging that for a quick buck. But people still treating them like gods. What's this person saying? Can you believe this person, slept with this person? Blah 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 blah. And there's the Bibles come out every week in the form of like tabloid magazines and this and that, and you follow the story of your god or your favorite this and that or the royal family, and people adhere to this because it's the thing that brings meaning. Now it is a bit shallow because sports, if we go back to that for a half second, is interesting because I've seen in sports, you got to work hard. You gotta like be good, or you can't do that on the field. You gotta work as a team. This kind of stuff. It always comes up, and it never comes up unless with certain members of my family. It comes up exclusively with sports. Like the moralizing happens, the ethical discussion light happens when there's a sports game on, and these virtues of hard work and teamwork and getting along with people and doing the right thing, or
even
standing
between
up for
they have
yourself.
segments of like them growing up and having like rinks and doing for the community, like charity works they do. There's always backstories on all these athletes during the games, and they describe it all in like excruciating detail because it doesn't
should have
interest
fought
me
there.
whatsoever.
No, that's exactly right, and we do that. And sports is probably healthier than tabloids, but I think
that, and they provide more good. Like they incentivize people to exercise and have fun and work as a team, and like there's so many good values to draw from sports and athletics that you don't get from tabloids, because tabloids are strictly gossip and misinformation. So nothing useful comes from knowing something that's wrong and for it, believing it.
A made-up story of a made-up real person. Okay, I'm saying like a celebrity is a made-up person, but they are real. But are they?
But to like Photoshop them with a big belly and say they're pregnant and they're hiding it is just like, that's so useless if they're not actually pregnant and they're not actually hiding it. Like nothing comes from that investment of energy. Whereas the investment of energy into sports, it draws a whole bunch of other senses like community and values and hard work and exercise and, diet, nutrition, charity, and all this other stuff too. So like choosing which mythologies we follow and recognizing that they're all mythologies, right from science to religion and everything in between, I think is helpful, because then it stops us from fighting about the inconsequential details. Like we start focusing on the actual substance rather than just the superficiality of the written in stone words saying, no, you quoted it wrong, or you interpreted it wrong, or this god did this, not that god, or what. Like those details are so irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. The important and the gravitas of the myth, the usefulness to it, in triggering that part of our brain that we can't get rid of or dissect. The point of it is to have a deeper thought when we're like, we're repulsed naturally from thinking that hard because it gives us a headache.
Right. So and it gives us that ethical primer, I guess would be an interesting way. Like it downloads an ethical primer into our head passively, which it sounds so boring and to say it like that, but that's kind of what happens. I think it's like an evolved trigger too. Yes. Oh, definitely.
Eventually we might not need it like 100,000 years from now because we have everything we need in front of us. But right now we can't deny the fact that we've evolved.
Right. But now being human and being a human that has gone through a process of it, I think this is a good place to kind of start wrapping up, is that it's such an absolute pleasure to engage in these, just on a spiritual, on a physical, like every aspect when you're engaging in these stories. Now you have to be careful because you can get too wrapped up and your mythology can be, you only deal in Star Wars, where you could be dealing with, aspects, mythologies that can lead you to, get a job. And because Star Wars lore isn't really going to get you a job, but engineering lore is definitely going to get you a job. It's better chance. Now, that being said, once you're done work, once all your responsibilities are over, there's nothing wrong with engaging with myth. I'd say it's better to engage in more in better myth, in higher quality, get the good stuff. You can afford it. We can all afford it. We've democratized this stuff. But the other thing is, like, even in Shakespeare's time, they had seating for the plebs, and everyone was going in, like, of all classes were watching Shakespeare, and it was seen as just kind of sustenance. You should be able to watch entertainment because you should be able to engage in myth. It's almost like, I don't want to say it's a right, but it's part of being human to engage with myth. And to get rid of it because, well, we only need to engage in the objective reality. And maybe in 100,000 years we won't need it, but we won't, just because we don't need it doesn't mean we can't have it, I think, is one thing. And we should just tell stories. And I think being honest about telling stories and being honest about how we tell stories and treating it as something we do it's not a bad thing. And I don't think engaging in it is bad. I think it can be unhealthy like anything else, but
I think the biggest thing, as my final comment, is that it's impossible to avoid it. So even people who think that they don't engage in myth, they do. You just engage in different myths because that part of your brain is still there and it's still going to attach itself to something in your life because that's what compels us to have myths. Like we've been doing it for like tens of thousands of years as a species. Like we can't not have supernatural ideas. Like until we figure out what consciousness is and put it in a box and like create consciousness out of silicon matter or whatever, like the question of consciousness is still going to be something we contemplate. And as soon as you start doing that, you're delving into the realm of myth. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just being self-aware of the myths that you adopt makes you less likely to be manipulated by your myths, first of all. And second of all, it guides your train of thought so that you're not wasting your energy thinking and memorizing specific inconsequential details. And instead, you're favoring the contemplation of the deeper metaphysics of the conflicts of interest or the issues at hand of virtue and honor and heroism and life's purpose and meaning and all of these actually important, hard to think about things. That's what the myth is all about. And there's nothing wrong with a myth, and there's nothing to say that it's unscientific to have a myth, because certain myths can't be disproven. We can't actually know for sure that God didn't intervene because you'd have to be God to be overseeing God. So there are certain types of logical fallacies that people fall into that don't actually matter. It's literally irrelevant to the story and teachings of Christ, whether or not he was physically the embodiment or the son of God. So having those, or going to war, the obvious example, like shooting people because of their belief. Obviously, you've gone off track with your myth. That's not the point of storytelling.
Actually, you brought that last point there was really interesting, and I'm sorry to the viewer, but this is probably going to take us off on a tangent. And I have this note here, and you segued and said, and it's kind of like, if you think you know reality better than the passive meanderings of 10,000 years of billions of people, that kind of hubris in myth making, I think, is a lot of what makes bad stories. You get stuff like Scientology, where it's like, I'm gonna create a new mythology intentionally to and it like, some people buy it, but it doesn't resonate with humanity. It's not universal. Or you get something like a lot of what's being created now, where they see the power of mythology, and I'm like, okay, who's they? But I'm talking about you're getting a lot of stuff out of Hollywood nowadays that doesn't make any sense. That's just kind of like, what's going on? What are they trying to tell you? And you look at it and it's just it's like a postmodern messaging, or it's got like social justice stuff stuck in there, or it's got stuff, the right's not really making anything. So they're not really doing any of their own myth making. But
creativity is not their forte. They're conservatives. Let's stick with what we have.
That's not, they're just not doing it. It's kind of what I'm thinking. I don't want to paint that broad of a brush, but what we're seeing now coming out of Hollywood is now a lot of just blatant moralizing along lines that do not really exist within morality. Like diversity is literally just skin color, and they're just pushing this at us. Or they keep pushing the fact that, you know, there's no difference between men and women, and a 90-pound girl can beat up, you know, legions of thugs in any movie. And it's just kind of like, I don't believe it. And you get cognitive dissonance because they're trying to tell you this is reality and they're not. And so I have this note here that says, and I must have written it when I was thinking about this at some point, where you get art made to adhere to momentary fads rather than eternal truths will just be propaganda. And I guess, what did I mean by that? But
you're saying people are creating an image that they want other people to adopt, and they use their stories and visual imagery to push that type of projection onto other people, as opposed to showing them things they already relate to.
Right.
You're trying to enforce a type of view rather than show them something that understood intrinsically.
Right. And you get this with Nazi Germany, where stuff like, and in the early 20th century with like stuff like Triumph of the Will, where they're like, you know, we don't like black people, says the KKK. And Triumph of the Will is the KKK movie. And they are presenting something, and you watch it and it's just like, it's an interesting perspective on history as a primary source. But I'm not going to watch it being like, oh, you've changed my mind, because that's not how, like, it's just racist. It's literally just a
I think meditation. The intention is to normalize it, but that's how a racist person would try to normalize something that's weird to them. You know what I mean? They do it so dumbly that it's just obvious and in your face, and you're just like, or stop rubbing it in. Just have them there and stop making a point to notice it. Like every black character I see in a movie or TV show now, they in their lines have a thing like, oh, it's because I'm black. Like they always point it out, and you're like, I can see it. Just normalize it by being there and existing. You don't have to say it every single time.
Like, we really didn't care that you were black.
Or like, we noticed. Like, you didn't have to say it. But somebody who doesn't get it thinks that a black guy has to say I'm black for people to understand.
Well, and this is why I don't, like, I'm really worried about things like, and not worried, but like disappointed with things like the new Lord of the Rings show. Because I know Chris doesn't follow it enough, but I find a lot of the myth of Lord of the Rings really strikes me, and I every time I get into it, I'm just like, yeah, thank you for re-upping my moral center. But they're making a new show, and the trailer seems like there's going to be nudity in it, and the trailer seems like there's going to be a lot of, you know, I'm going to sound like a racist here, but like there's a lot of unnecessary ethnic changes and gender changes that that makes me sound really right-wing, but it's a myth intentionally made for a European, specifically, like it's a English myth. This is a mythology, just like the Aeneid was the mythology of Rome. Lord of the Rings is the mythology of Britain and to some extent America. It resonates a lot with Canada because, you know, we have that same brutality, but it's also based strangely, not strangely for Tolkien, but strangely for how it resonates, is it's based heavily on Catholicism. And for some reason, he wrote a Catholic myth with no real reference to Catholicism that represents the values of Christianity in such a vivid way that it just speaks to us. And they're just going to say, no, what's important is representing, we need to have more women on screen. Like, it's so unbelievably shallow. Oh, we need to make black female people do all the things. We need to degrade our male characters. And you get this with a lot of like old guys who are noticing, like, why are all the middle-aged guys on TV bumbling around? It's because that's what they think people want to see. But it's a shallower representation of what you want. So the message,
I think we'll grow out of that, though. That's just a temporary phase while people are like knee-jerk reactions to realizing that they've been so off the wall for so long that they just jump to the opposite extreme.
I
Like,
think
they just
it will
went too far.
I think it will grow out of it too, but I think we'll grow into a new form of stupid, kind of like Public Opinion, Walter
Yeah,
Lippmann
that's how
style, where
evolution
it's like,
works.
yeah, we're gonna find something else stupid to talk about. And
It's the
right
quantum
now,
walk. That's what we're
yeah,
doing.
and because like 20 years ago, it was, I don't remember what it was 20 years ago, but like we all of a sudden weren't allowed to talk about. I guess 20 years ago it was Islam. 20 years before that, it was like, maybe we should love the Russians. 20 years before that, it was like, maybe we should not think the Germans are Nazis, kind of that kind of stuff. But we get through this and we're working our way through it. It just feels really stupid right now because this is another topic, is that we're not used to being able to have such a democratic discourse. So that's it. So I think that,
so affirmative action aside, we're still on the right path and we're still doing more good than harm. So I'm not completely against the actions we're taking, because at least it makes it obvious that there needs to be a change and an adjustment.
right.
So like, I understand and I get it. It bothers me and annoys me and I complain about it. But it's way better than having signs on doors that says no Jews or Italians, or, you know what I mean? Like, we're so far beyond women's rights to vote, or like giving people mortgages based on their skin color.
Right. I
So
think
thankfully we're improving. It's just we're still in the process of, being mature about our improvement.
I think what's happening now is a bit of an overcorrection.
And that's what that'll always happen.
But, and the thing that when it comes down to it is, if I watch it, will it resonate as mythology? And I think that's something I think I'm going to end on this, is that when you watch something, pay attention to your reaction. How do you engage with it? What gives you certain, this is an act of self-awareness, I guess. What changes to your, what chemical changes happen when you're watching something? Do you get mad? There was one Star Wars show we were watching, and Megan, my wife, was just getting absolutely livid. She's like, that's not how people work. She was just going off. She couldn't explain it. It just was so discordant with reality to her that, like, it bugged me, but I was just used to it. And it was just so discordant with reality to her that she just had to let it out, and we had to like move it. Same with the Star Trek show. There was one scene where I'm going to swear here, where one of the characters just looks at the main character, this god that we've put as a representation of integrity, knowledge, and decision making and leadership. And she just looks at him and go like, who are you to do any of these things? You sheer fucking hubris. And we just turned it off. And we're like, no, this is not good. It's just, we turned it off because we realized that if we were going to keep watching, it was just going to make us angry. We're just going to complain about it. And I guess this is about 2 hours of complaining, but whatever. And we went and watched something better. But when you're watching something that is a positive representation of reality, it's not always going to be like a lot of war movies, like Band of Brothers is good myth making for war. Even though it's hard to watch, or something like the movie Downfall, like that's not a happy movie. But it's a positive representation of the way people act in those situations. Watch what you do when you're watching them. What bugs you? What glorifies you? What makes you exalt into this? And what ethics and virtues do you gravitate towards? Because we all gravitate towards different ethics and virtues. Someone will be like, I like stories about heroism. Some people I like stories about sacrifice. Some people like stories about leadership. Some people like stories, and it also could depend on mood, but this is a good way to examine yourself, because encountering the myth is encountering parts of yourself. And so you have to pay attention to yourself while you're engaging with the myth. I think that's where a good place to let it go.
Yeah, thanks for listening. You've been tuned in to Frivolous Gravitas. You can check the description for RSS feeds and social media links and all that kind of jazz.
All right.
Catch you next week.
See you guys. Have a good week.